Doesn't give us too much, but a little bit of shelter. Well, welcome to Sunset Hills Cemetery. This is Bozeman's cemetery. We have one cemetery in Bozeman, which is kind of crazy for a town of this size. Usually, maybe he was for us. Oh, maybe not. Usually towns like Helena, Butte, other towns, Missoula, have a few different cemeteries, but this is Bozeman's only cemetery. We used to have a cemetery that was located and is still located off of North 7th Street, but it has been out of operation for many years, so this is kind of it. And today we're going to be wandering through the historic portion of Sunset Hills Cemetery. So we'll be kind of over in this direction where the newer part of the cemetery. Hi, are you here for the walking tour?
Yeah, with Marcia?
With Marcia. Marcia Small?
Yeah.
Oh, she might still be coming. Good.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just saw her. I was at MSU.
Oh,
She
good.
invited me.
Good. Yes, you're at the right spot. Welcome.
I was a little confused. Okay.
So this is a historic walking tour focusing on the symbols of Sunset Hill Cemetery, some of the historic symbols. So welcome. I'm glad you're here. And maybe Marcia will come eventually too. Yeah, all right. So anyway, this cemetery has been here in Bozeman pretty much since Bozeman's inception. Bozeman was founded in, any locals know when Bozeman was founded, what year? You used to be local. 1864. So Bozeman was founded in 1864. And so this cemetery was probably founded about that same time. We know that there was definitely people being buried up here by about 1867. But the interesting thing is that this location has been a burial spot for not just since 1864, but for indigenous people before that as well, because there has been some indigenous burials that have been located kind of over the bluff of this cemetery hill in the past. So it's kind of interesting to think about cemeteries. Current cemeteries may have been placed there because they knew it was a place where indigenous people had also laid their people to rest. So something to think about. And I see that happening in a lot of different places. Have you guys heard of the Anzac site? Probably some of you have. And the Anzac site is one of the oldest burials in the United States, and a young child was buried there about 12,600 years ago. And that burial spot is located just next to the current day cemetery of Wilsall, Montana. So that's kind of interesting if you think about it. And now that I've told you that, you'll probably be finding this wherever you go, that current day cemeteries are located where there had been indigenous, I don't know if you want to call them cemeteries, but indigenous burials. But we're here today to talk a little bit about the symbolism on the headstones in this cemetery. And symbols are really interesting. So can anyone tell me what a symbol is? Or maybe give me an example of a symbol. Anyone?
Praying hands.
Okay, yeah, what does this symbolize? When you see this, what do you think of?
Quiet, solitude, prayer.
Okay.
Holiness.
All right, good, yeah, so that's a symbol. So if you see this symbol, you kind of know what that means, right? What other symbols do we have in our lives every day?
Traffic signs.
Yeah, stop sign. If you see that stop sign, it does have words on it, but you know exactly what that means. You guys have logos probably on your clothing. Tristan has a projectile point on his hat. So if you look at that, you can be like, Tristan must be interested in archaeology of some kind, or he must be interested in things from the past. And so symbols are a way that we communicate with each other. So that's how Tristan communicates with the world, what his job is, or maybe what he's interested in. And so we do that with our clothing. We do that with stickers that we have on our water bottles, and then we do it in a larger way with stop signs and red lights and things like that, traffic signals. So symbols are an important part of our life now, And they've always been an important part of our life. And of course, the symbols on these headstones are communicating something to the larger world about this person who's buried there. And of course, symbols change over time. And so if you look at the hashtag today, you know, the hashtag like hashtag extreme history or something like that, the hashtag has a much different meaning today than it did 10 years ago. What did the hashtag mean 10 years ago? Pound sign, right. So symbols change over time. So that symbol of the hashtag has changed over time, and the symbols that we're going to be seeing on these headstones have changed over time too. But some of them have stayed the same. So let's go look at our first headstone. Follow me this way. So this is the headstone of Mr. Silas Ralston. And so what symbols do you see on this headstone as you're looking at it? You can see this, right? The finger pointing up. Any thoughts? Maybe that the people who buried Mr. Silas Ralston thought he was going up to heaven. So that kind of is a Christian symbol that, you know, this person was going up. And hands on headstones are really, there's a lot of hand imagery. There's a lot of hand symbolism on headstones. Sometimes fingers pointing up, sometimes fingers pointing down. Not what you think. The finger pointing down was God's hand going down to grab the person to bring them up to heaven. So that's kind of what that symbolizes. Sometimes there's symbols of hands that are clasped, and that is a symbol of God grabbing the hand of the person and bringing them up to heaven, or it's the symbol of a husband and wife together in death. And so sometimes you'll see the hands clasped on a headstone that has both the husband and the wife buried beneath it. And sometimes on those symbols you'll see, and I'll show you one as we walk around here, you'll see one with a woman's cuff, and then you'll see one with the man's cuff. So you can really see that. So we're in the Masonic section of the cemetery, and so this is a Mason symbol. It's very different than the Mason symbol right there. You see the compass and the square with the G in the middle. That's kind of the symbol you often see for the Masons. This one's a little different, and this is different because he was kind of a higher rank in the Masonic order. And so that's, if a Mason, I don't know if any of you guys are Masons, but if you're a Mason, you'll look at that and you'll say, oh, he was of this rank. So that is why he has that symbol on his headstone, because he wanted other people to know that. Now, we also see some writing on this headstone, and it says, Silas Ralston, born 1838, was killed 1878. So we know there's a story there, don't we? So we did some research on Mr. Silas Ralston and found out that yes, in fact, he was killed in 1878. He was killed right downtown on Main Street in downtown Bozeman in a saloon. So Mr. Silas Ralston was sheriff at the time in 1878. And one night things got a little rowdy in the saloon, so he was called in to break up this fight that was happening. So he went in and he started to kind of try to pull the two men apart. And one man had a gun, and the gun went off and it shot Silas Ralston. He died right there on the saloon floor. And so the town was in mourning about this because he was a very revered sheriff. Everyone really liked him. He wasn't married. He was 40 years old when he died, so he was pretty young. And so they were in deep mourning. And I just want to read a little bit of his obituary because it gives you a sense of, did I bring that? Let me see if I did. Yeah. It gives you kind of a sense of what a funeral was like in 1878 here in Bozeman. So it says, at precisely 2:00 p.m., the corpse, in a substantial coffin trimmed with black velvet and elegant silver mountings, was solemnly borne to the Methodist Episcopal Church, where a short but very impressive religious ceremony was conducted by the Reverend Bishop Tuttle. The chants and hymns selected for the occasion were solemnly and perfectly rendered by the choir. After the service at the church, the solemn procession was formed in the following order. First, the Silver Coronet Band. Second, members of the Masonic Lodge, because of course he was a Mason. Third, county officials with appropriate badges of mourning. Fourth, the hearse with the corpse and pallbearers. Fifth, citizens on foot. Sixth, citizens on, hi, come on in, come on over. Sixth, citizens on horseback, and seventh, citizens in carriages. So all those people were in procession. Hi, Marcia. Hi. Say it again. Ronan, nice to meet you. Welcome, welcome. So we're talking a little bit about Silas Ralston here, and I'm reading about his funeral procession here to bury him in this spot. And so all these citizens came here in line together to bury Mr. Silas Ralston. It goes on to say, notwithstanding the fact that the rain was pouring down during the entire time of the funeral, as though the elements were in active sympathy with the grief-stricken community. The procession was very large, extending from the church almost the entire length of Main Street. At the grave, the beautiful and impressive ceremonies of the Masonic order were performed, and the corpse was lowered down to its last resting place. The procession, returning in regular order, preceded by the band, which played solemn funeral marches, going and returning to the entrance of the Masonic Hall when the fraternity passed in and the large assembly dispersed. So that is a little bit about Mr. Silas Ralston and his burial here. And we can learn a lot about him. This is a picture of Silas. Died when he was 40, and he looks about that age in this photograph. Just by having a quick glance at his headstone, huh? We know he was probably of the Christian faith. We know he was a Mason. We know he died tragically at a young age of 40 years old. So lots to learn. Okay, let's move on to our next stop. Follow me this direction. Careful for limbs. They'll grab you. We're not going to go too far here. We're just going to come over this direction. Okay. So we're going to talk here about Mr. Louis Sperling. And this is a beautiful headstone, isn't it? It's Gothic. It's got these Gothic arches. It's so beautiful. And you'll notice that there's a lot of this particular style of headstone in Sunset Hill Cemetery. So if you just look right behind you, right directly behind you, there's one just right there. And so you'll notice them as we walk around today. There's a lot of them that look like this. And so this is marble, and they would just mail order these headstones, and they would be shipped here. And then a local mason or a local stone cutter would engrave the information on the headstone. So you'll see some things we've already talked about. This is very faint, but you can see the Masonic symbol there. And so we know that Mr. Louis Sperling was a Mason. Of course, he's buried in the Masonic section of the cemetery, so he was probably a good standing Mason. But then you see this 3-link chain right below it. Can you guys see that? It's pretty faint, but it's basically 3 links of a chain. Anyone know what that symbol stands for? Nope, good guess. Well, kind of in those days maybe, but that was the International Order of the Odd Fellows. So he was an Odd Fellow too, and the Odd Fellows was a fellowship kind of like the Masons. They were a fraternal order, and so just men could join, and they would get together once or twice a month, and they would do good works in their community and help each other. It was kind of a networking thing. There's still Odd Fellows in Montana, not in Bozeman. We no longer have a Oddfellow Lodge here in Bozeman, but we do have a Masonic Lodge. In fact, we still have 2 Masonic Lodges. So he was also an Oddfellow. And so we can learn that he was those 2 things, but what else can we learn about Mr. Sperling from this headstone? What else do you see here? So this is Hebrew written on this headstone, and there's only 2 headstones here in Sunset Hills that we found Hebrew on. This is one of them, and so we know he was Jewish. So we can guess that just by looking at his headstone, and then confirm that when we read through his obituary. So I'll read to you what the Hebrew says. I called up the local rabbi and I said, I've got some Hebrew. Can you translate? And he said, yes, I can do that. So I'll read to you what it says. It says, "May he rest in peace on his place of repose." This was located right on Main Street, and that's where Mr. Sperling had his mercantile. And he had immigrated to America from Russia, and he had come here with his family. And when he was fairly young, and then in the California gold rush, he had gone to California, and then he made his way himself up to Bozeman. He got married here. He met a woman in Virginia City. They got married and started their family here. He was fairly successful, and he's buried here. These other folks around him are his family. His wife is not buried here, and I can't track her down. She might have remarried, and then I kind of lose her because she changed her name, or she might have moved back east. She was from the New York area as well. She might have just moved home, but she is not here with Mr. Louis Sperling. So a beautiful headstone, and shows the diversity of Bozeman at that time. And so let's move on. We're going to head up this direction. And I think the sun might be coming out. That's exciting. Yeah, exactly. Oh, and we have our local herd of deer over here.
Down in Georgia on the train, the road's getting muddy and the leaves getting damp. Gotta catch a freight train and leave this.
And this whole section over here is the Oddfellows section. So these fraternal orders would often buy sections of the cemetery so their members would have a space in those sections of the cemetery. So it was kind of another, benefit of being a Mason or an Oddfellow. We're going to look at this headstone right here. It's pretty cool, isn't it? This is called a tree stone. And tree stones were really popular between the 1880s and about 1905. And they were carved out of limestone. And you'll find a lot of them in cemeteries in the Midwest and the West. They were really popular. And we have about 5 of these tree stones in this cemetery. And that's not very many. A lot of cemeteries have a lot more than that, especially in Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, kind of the western areas. Oregon, Washington, you'll see them a lot. And so these, and this is a pretty impressive tree stone. It's pretty tall. Very ornate, lots of symbolism going on this tree stone. So you'll see that it's got the person's name. Of course, he was a Mason. And then his name is down here as well, kind of written. His last name was Walton, and it's kind of, the pieces are coming off, but it's in that, they look like little branches that are forming his name. And so you'll also see down here the fern. And the fern symbolizes humility. And so you could often pick which symbols you want on these tree stones, because every tree stone you look at is a little bit different. And so probably his wife or his family looked at a catalog and said, oh, we want a fern on it, and we want the anchor on it, and we want this and that. So all of them are kind of different, which is kind of neat. So the fern represents humility. The anchor symbolizes hope. A little bit different. You know, when we see an anchor today, we think of water and marines and, that sort of thing. But then it symbolized hope. We have this wreath, kind of a wreath of roses at the top. And that symbolizes that idea of being crowned by God, to be crowned in heaven. And then we have over here, we have this vine of ivy. And ivy always symbolizes friendship because it clings to whatever it's holding on to. And then it also symbolizes the Trinity, because there's 3 leaves to the ivy bush or leaf.
Well, I don't know that because you have an oak leaf there.
Yeah, and then we have the oak. So this is an oak tree, isn't it? Yeah, and so we have the oak branches and the oak leaves. And oak symbolizes what? Do you guys know what the oak symbolizes? Whoa, strength. So strength. So, and then you see that the oak branch is broken. And so that symbolizes that idea of kind of a life cut short. And some people say that the number of stumps on the tree stone symbolizes how many children the person had in their lifetime. And I haven't checked that on this one. I haven't tracked down how many children he had to see if that rings true. But then if you look over here, you'll see, you guys have to come over and look. I'm going to make you look at this because it's so cool. You see the little owl?
Yeah.
The owl is here. And
The
so,
wisdom?
yes, wisdom. And so I love that part of it. And so sometimes they'll have a stag or a deer or something, but Mr. Walton had the owl, which I think is so cool. So that is a tree stone. And like I said, we have a few of them here. And we can't see any of the others from this location. But if you go into a cemetery, look at the tree stones because they're always really different and very interesting. So let's head around this direction now. And I'll show you that over here, there's these oak leaves again. So you'll see oak leaves and other botanical leaves on a lot of these headstones. And in the Victorian era, every plant, every flower had so much meaning and symbolism. So you can look up those symbols, like if you're in a cemetery and you see an oak leaf or some kind of leaf on a headstone, you can look that up and see what it means, and it can tell you a lot about what the person thought about or wanted to emulate in their life, in their lives. And then over here you see some more leaves on this side of the headstone. And then here you see the Daughters of the American Revolution. And so this woman who was married to Brooks Martin, her name was Ella Martin. She was a daughter of the American Revolution. So a lot of times you'll see that symbol on headstones. And you see one there as well. So our current chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution really looked to this woman because she was one of the founders of the DAR group here in Bozeman. So let's keep going this way. Okay, everybody, we're going to talk about Mary Frances Jackson. And she's got a very large headstone, doesn't she? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about her life, and then you'll understand why she has such a large headstone in comparison to all the other folks around her. So Mary Frances Jackson's working name was Lizzie Woods. And so that kind of gives you probably a hint of what her work was. So Lizzie Woods was one of our madams here in Bozeman. She grew up in the Midwest. She grew up in Iowa. And then she came out to Montana in the 1870s as a young woman. And there weren't a lot of jobs out here in Montana at that time. And so a lot of women fell into prostitution, and more than likely she did. But she was a very smart woman, and she was an entrepreneur. And so she really made a life for herself here in Bozeman. And she made a life for herself in prostitution, but she kind of went up the ranks and became a madam. And as a madam, she bought a house in the Bozeman red light district, kind of over, for those of you who live in Bozeman, the red light district was located right off of the south side of Mendenhall Street between Bozeman and Rouse. And that's where the red light district was. And she had a large 2-story house that she built in the red light district. She bought the land, and then she had the house built in 1883. And she lived in that house until she died in 1918 at the age of about 66 years old. And so while living in that house, she ran it as a house of prostitution, but she also had a saloon in the house, and so she made a lot of money off of alcohol. So at that time, you could go to the local saloon downtown and buy a beer for 25 cents, or you could go to Lizzie Woods' house and buy a bottle of beer for $1. So she really upped the rate and made a lot of money off of the saloon aspect of her business. She also had ranches ranches. She owned a ranch in Townsend. She owned other property in Bozeman. She bought and sold a lot of property over the years. She then, towards the end of her life, bought a house in Livingston, or I shouldn't say a house, she bought a building on Main Street in Livingston. And it was a building with 17 rooms in it. It had been a lodging house, and she transformed it into a lodging house, a different kind of lodging house, a female boarding house. And so she ran that business as a brothel in Livingston towards the end of her life, around 1917, and then she died in 1918. She actually died over in Livingston, and they brought her body back to Bozeman for burial. But she did pretty well financially, hence the large headstone. But when she died, I don't think she knew she was going to die, because she didn't plan for this headstone. So it was her family that bought the headstone for her. And of course, her family didn't put her working name on the headstone. They put her maiden name, Mary Frances Jackson, on the headstone instead. But I just wanted to give you a sense of how much a funeral would cost in 1918 when she died. And so this is what's listed in her probate records on the costs of her funeral. So she had watchers, but they paid $5. So a watcher's service was basically someone who watched the body after the death, before the burial. The body always had to be watched by someone. And that was for a few different reasons, but they always had someone watching the body. So they paid that person $5. They had music at their funeral, which they paid $10 for. She was embalmed for $35. They bought some dress, underwear, and stockings for her to be worn during her funeral for $33.75. Her casket cost $375, which is a lot of money in those days. And I looked up the type of casket it was, and it was very fancy. So she was buried in a very fancy casket. Let's see, the plot was $25. The lot fee, so not just a plot, but they had a lot fee as well, was $10. And then $275 for the monument. So quite a big chunk of change. Mary Frances Jackson was well known in this town as a madam. So I think it's really interesting that she's kind of buried right in amongst everybody else. You know, it wasn't like she was off at the side or in the corner. She was just buried right here. So they had a little bit of a different, way of thinking about the prostitutes and the madams here in Bozeman than in other towns. Like in Butte and Helena, the women of the evening were all put kind of at the edge of the cemetery. Here, they're just kind of mixed in amongst everybody. So maybe a little more egalitarian here, I don't know. So let's head this direction.
Money by the pond with you. I wanna go west. I got the Milwaukee Blues.
Okay.
Got the Milwaukee Blues.
So I want to talk a little bit about these headstones, because these are really different than the marble and the granite headstones that you see. And this headstone is hollow, and it's made out of white bronze. So basically, that was a fancy way of saying zinc. And so this is zinc, but this is made, they called it white bronze, and it was very light. Because it's hollow, it was much cheaper to ship this kind of headstone than a granite headstone or a marble headstone. So these became pretty popular in about early 1870s. These became popular, and they were popular until the First World War, when any kind of iron or metal of any kind went to the war production. And so these fell out of use then. But they were really popular because of their lightweight and easy shipping and cost-effective shipping. And they're really beautiful. They really look like a marble headstone or like a granite headstone. And you could do a lot with them. So it's called white bronze, and it's hollow. And so it was, and these were very much like the tree stones, and that you could look in the catalog and you could pick out what you wanted on this headstone. So there's all these different symbols. So this is a page from the catalog, and you could just pick out whatever you wanted. And so knowing your person that had passed away, knowing that they were young or kind or, you know, whatever attributes they had, you could pick out symbols to put on the headstone that really emulated the person. And so, and that's what they did. All of these white bronze headstones are very different as well. But some of the symbolism on it, you can see the dove on the top. And then also this draping. This draping is really a Victorian, was really popular during the Victorian time, because the drape kind of symbolizes that idea of this world and the afterworld, and that there was a curtain between the two, and they would part that curtain to walk from this world into the next world, and then that curtain would close. And so draping was really, you'll see it all over headstones, the idea of that drape, and that's what it symbolizes. You'll also see the wreath, like we talked about before. And then you'll see on this side, you'll see the lyre, which is a musical instrument. And oftentimes you'll see that one of the strings on the lyre is broke. And that symbolizes that idea of that the song is no longer being sung because the person has died. And then there's on this side, let's see, it's on this side, there's an anchor like we saw before that symbolizes hope. And let's see, that's about it for this one. Sometimes they have sheaves of wheat, and wheat is a very popular symbol in Montana, because of course we had a lot of wheat farmers, wheat growers here, but that would symbolize fertility and life. And in the Midwest, you see a lot of corn symbolized on headstones. I was going to point out too that you mentioned that, Marcia. Agnes Taylor is the person who's buried here, and she died in childbirth, and her child died about a year later and is buried right next to her. So of course a lot of the headstones that you see in the cemetery are of children, and we have a this shows a child's grave, but there's a lot of child's graves mixed within the cemetery, and then more recently there's a segregated section for children who are buried in the cemetery. But in the historic time period, they would just bury them in their family plots, or in just kind of intermixed with everybody. I also wanted to point out that the section right on the corner here is the African American section of the cemetery. So a lot of our Black community members, historically Black community, is buried in that section of the cemetery. And we don't know if they did it because they were all friends and family and intermarried, if they all segregated themselves, or if the community segregated them into that section. So let's head over this direction.
Old Bill Jones said before he died, fix the road so the boys can ride. When they ride, they're gonna ride the rods, 'cause they put all the trust in the hands of God. Hands of God.
Well, this is new. There's a lot of things here left on this grave. I haven't seen these before. So oftentimes, you know, people will leave things on graves in commemoration of the person, and it looks like someone has left things on this grave. But this is an important grave for a few different reasons, and this is the grave of Mary Blackmore. And Mary Blackmore did not grow up here in Bozeman. She did not live in the United States. She was from England. She was born and raised in Salisbury, England. And she was of the elite. She was of the high class of the English countryside. She married a gentleman who was called Lord Blackmore. So she was often they were called Lord and Lady Blackmore. They were not actually lords and ladies, but they often were called that because they kind of ran with that class of people in England. They were friends with the Queen. They were friends with Queen Victoria. And her husband was an entrepreneur, and he had a lot of business here in the United States. He had a lot of business with railroads and transportation. And so he wanted to come over here in July of 1872 because he had put a lot of financing into the surveys that were going into what would become Yellowstone National Park. So he financed the Hayden survey, or partly financed the Hayden survey, and he partly financed a few other surveys where people were going into the area that would become the park. And so he was part of creating Yellowstone National Park. And so in 1872 in July, that was the year the park was officially formed. And so he wanted to come over with his wife and be a part of that opening, kind of be one of the first tourists. So they came over from England and they took the ship over. They went to New York first. They came via stagecoach into Bozeman in July of 1872. And on the stagecoach ride from Helena to Bozeman, Mary became ill. She became very sick. And they were going to go into the park the next day, and she said, you know what, I just don't think I can go. William Blackmore was her husband. I just don't think I can go. I'll stay here, you go ahead. And so he, along with some other people, started into the park. When they got to the pass, the Bozeman Pass, a runner came running up to him and said, you've got to come back. It's not looking good for Mary. She's probably going to pass away soon. You better come back to Bozeman. So he came back to Bozeman, but before he got to her, she had died. So she probably had an inflammation of her intestines, periodontitis, and that's probably how she died so quickly. And of course, that happened quite a bit in those days. And so she died here. They had made a pact before they left England that if one of them died on the trip, they would just be buried where they died. And so he talked to the family that they were staying with and said, where do you bury your people? And they said, up on the hill. It's owned by Daniel Rouse, but that's where we bury everybody. And William Blackmore said, what, you don't have a cemetery, a city cemetery? You know, he thought that was just very uncivilized of us. And he said, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk to Daniel Rouse and I'm going to buy a plot of land for you Bozemanites to have your own city cemetery. So that's what he did. So he bought this plot, kind of this historic section of the cemetery, and he bought it from Daniel Rouse and he gave it to the city of Bozeman. And then he buried his wife here. And so that's where she has been ever since, and that is why we have Mount Blackmore is named after William and Mary Blackmore, because of what he did. And then he did go back to England, and a few years later there was a financial crisis, a big financial drop in the market, and he lost almost all his money, and he committed suicide about 3 years after Mary died. So it's kind of a sad story. But they did put up this monument. He did send money a few years after she died, and the townspeople put this monument up for Mary. So,
Onto our pyramid.
yeah, so the pyramid is the symbol of the symbolism aspect of it. In the 1870s, and this kind of happens again and again, people get very interested in Egypt and the symbolism of Egypt. And at that time, in the 1870s, Europe, it was all the rage to kind of, look back to the past and look to the civilizations of Egypt and Greece and those places. And so pyramids were really popular for headstones. So it's very unique. We only have a couple pyramids in the cemetery, but this is one of them. So let's head this direction.
God, hand of God, in the hand of God.
This is probably the largest headstone in the cemetery. And this is the headstone of Mr. Nelson Story. He's one of our famous capitalists here in Bozeman. He came here in the 1860s. He came to Virginia City with his wife Ellen in 1864. And they then moved to Bozeman. And Nelson went down to Texas, purchased a herd of longhorn cattle and drove them back up to Montana, which has been made famous. That cattle drive has been made famous by the book Lonesome Dove, and then later the miniseries Lonesome Dove. And so he's famous for that cattle drive, but he drove those cattle up to Montana, and then he invested the money from those cattle that he sold and some goods that he brought up, and he just kept reinvesting, and he became Montana's first millionaire. He was not a very nice man, all records say, but he was definitely a very wealthy man when he died. And so he and his family are buried here, and his stone symbolizes his wealth for sure. And then this entry to his family plot is actually these columns were taken from a mansion that he had built here in Bozeman. So he had built a huge mansion in Bozeman, and it was on Main Street. It was torn down in 1929. And when it was torn down, these columns were placed here. So these columns were from his mansion that was on Main Street at one point in time. I wish they hadn't torn that building down. It was beautiful. But at least we have still a little part of it. So let's head this direction. Okay, everybody, so I've showed you a lot of historic graves so far today, but we're going to kind of end on a note. We're two from the end, so this is the second from the last headstone. But I wanted to talk about kind of the things you see in a cemetery and the things you don't see in a cemetery. So like my good friend Marcia Small was saying, is that she does work in cemeteries that no longer have a lot of headstones. And so that doesn't mean that there aren't lots of people represented there or people buried there. So when you go into a cemetery, you have to always remember that not everyone will have a headstone. And so, and that is definitely the case here in Sunset Hills Cemetery. So a lot of the people that are buried here, their headstones, they never had headstones in the first place, or their headstones have gone away for one reason or another. Maybe they were wooden and they've just disintegrated. Maybe, you know, a cow toppled it over and it just kind of fell into the ground and is buried down there somewhere now. So the things you see are symbols of those people, but the things you don't see are also symbolic. And so this area right here that you see kind of beyond this memorial here is the Poor Farm section of the cemetery. So this is the place where there's many people buried, but they didn't have the means, or their family didn't have the means to put a headstone up for them. So there's just many people here without headstones. And so for many years, you would walk into the cemetery and not realize that there was people buried in this section, because there's only a scattering of headstones here. So about in 2020, the Daughters of the American Revolution had heard about this Poor Farm section, and they wanted to put up a memorial so that people walking by this area would know that there was a group of people here who didn't have headstones. So that's what this memorial is. So it says, "Before you lie the graves of early Bozeman residents whose names have been lost to history," because we don't know their names. We know there are people here, but we no longer have their names written anywhere. And so they put that up in a ceremony, and it was really, I think it's really important that we make sure that we know that the people who are buried here are here, and that we honor those people along with the people like Nelson Story and Joseph Lindley and all the people with the big headstones. These people are just as important as those folks, so they should be honored as well. So I like that they did that. So I think it's really important. So now what we're going to do is we're going to head to our last headstone. And I think we can get to it okay. But we have to kind of, just follow me. I'll get you there. This way.
What said can the road Joe be? The Southern Pacific and the Santa Fe. Santa Fe. Oh, Santa Fe. Oh, the Southern Pacific and the Santa Fe.
Okay. So I like to end with this headstone because, of course, I started with we started in the Masonic section that talked about the Masons, and then we talked about the Odd Fellows, and we talked about a lot of those other fraternal groups. And when I say fraternal, that means that women weren't included in those groups. You could, you can't be a Mason as a woman even today. And so there was women living at this time who were noticing this, and they were thinking, well, I want a group as well. I want to be part of a group. that has this community focus and that has benefits in networking and benefits in other ways. And so a group of women got together, and let me get to my notes here. And they formed a group called the Royal Neighbors of America. And this was basically a group for women that was very similar to the Masons and to the Oddfellows. So it was a group of women who would come together once or twice a month. They would raise money and they would do good works in their community, but they also had benefits to this organization. So you paid dues to the organization, just like you did as a Mason. And then those dues would go to the women when they died. It would go to those women to help bury them. So it was kind of a funeral benefit, basically, with this organization. And that's what the Masons had, that's what the Oddfellows had, and that's why a lot of men join these organizations, is for that funeral benefit. But the women were joining the Royal Neighbors of America also for that funeral benefit. And so this woman, Angeline Johns, her mother was a member of the Royal Neighbors of America. And so when Angeline died as a young woman, her mother probably got that funeral benefit for her and was able to provide this very beautiful headstone, because this is a very beautiful headstone. And her mother and Angeline were not wealthy women. They were working class Bozemanites. And so this was a benefit that they gleaned from that organization. And this is the symbol of that organization, and it is the symbol for the Royal Neighbors of America. And the letters here stands for endurance, courage, modesty, understanding, and faith. So that's what those letters stand for. And that was kind of their tagline. That's what they believed in. And so this organization is still going here in America today. It's now more of a professional organization, so young women who are going into business can write grants for money from this organization. So that's kind of what they do today, but they started out a little bit different. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about this woman who is buried here. Her maiden name was Johns. She married a man whose name was Davidson. So her married name was Angeline Davidson. She was born in Missouri, and her mother came to Bozeman. And it was her and her mother and her brother that lived here, very working class family. Angeline married Mr. Davidson, and they shortly thereafter had a little baby, and she died in childbirth, and then the baby died pretty shortly afterwards. And I think the baby is buried here as well, but the baby is not recognized on the headstone. So I think this is just a really good symbol to kind of wrap up this tour, because it really speaks to this idea of community. So all these symbols that we've talked about today, if you think about it, really comes back to this idea of community and the importance of community, especially in the 1870s, the 1880s here in Bozeman, because people were coming out to this place in the West from all different parts of the nation and all different parts of the world. Even, people like Louis Sperling were coming here from different parts of the world. And so they all came here, and they all had to get along with each other. They all had to learn the same language, and they all had to form networks. And these fraternal organizations, and then this, I don't know if you call it a maternal organization, but that's probably what they did call it. But it was these organizations that really help people connect to each other and form this community of Bozeman that we still live in and work in today in community. And so with that is the end of my tour. So thank you guys for coming today and coming on the tour and thinking about symbols. And I think it's important within archaeology and anthropology to really think about that idea of symbolism and these sacred places. And of course, the cemetery, like I said at the beginning, is kind of a very important sacred place. So it's important to think about these places filled with people, and to continue to fill these places with people and learn from places like this, like the cemetery. So thanks everybody, and I'll walk you out so you don't get lost.